Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Businessology Show. It's so great to have you. And, we bring great guests to teach us about agency growth. And we're going to be talking about some metrics. This is stuff we talk about with our clients, and it's really difficult sometimes to understand metrics. And so this is a part two. We did an intro with David Baker, and so we're doing another one. And you probably know David Baker. You've heard his name, listened to the Two Bobs podcast with him and Blair. Such an amazing show. And David is the author of a number of books, The Business of Expertise, one of my favorites, and a new book that's just come out, I believe. But what we're going to talk about is one he released a number of years ago called Financial Management of a Marketing Firm. So let's kind of dive in. So David, thanks for coming on the show with us. We appreciate it, man.
Oh, I love doing this. I really enjoyed our first talk and didn't know if we'd have enough to talk about on the second time, but I think we do.
Yes. Well, there's always a lot to talk about. Now, your most recent book, it's out or it's about to come out? Or
it's heading to press in about 5 days, I guess. So I don't know how long that'll take, probably 2 months, 3 months. And then I'll find out what the marketplace thinks. But at the moment, I'm very optimistic.
Well, yeah, just the cover that you've been sharing and the title alone is pretty intriguing. So I think everybody's kind of pumped to dive into that. So.
Well, the bar is very low. I just read yesterday, there's this publication called The Yellow Sheet, and of the 58,000 trade books that are released every year, fully 50% of them don't sell 12 copies. I don't mean 12 a day. I mean total 12 copies. If I can sell 13 copies, then I will be above average.
Okay. Wow. That's a pretty low bar. Come on, David. We're rooting for you, man. We hope you can do it. Very cool. Well, let's dive in. So we're going to really just be asking a lot of basic metric questions. I want to dive into some, verbiage and labels this profession places on a lot of different things and actually see if we can figure out what a lot of them mean. Now, but just real quick, the financial management of a marketing firm, I don't know how it originally came out, but I got the download. I guess it was in a hard copy at some point.
It was.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
That went out of print, and then the PDF, it'll come back out in revised version. I finished the revision 2 weeks ago. It'll come back out in print and in PDF too.
Okay. So you did that back in 2010. Now, why did you redo it? Were there some clarifications you wanted to put in there, or is it pandemic related?
More, it was just embarrassing, just honestly. The world has changed so much in 12 years. And, it took me, 3 days to read through it carefully and axe a couple chapters, add 3 more chapters. And then some of it was just the language has changed, but that was forgivable, right? But mainly it was that the metrics have changed drastically. Yeah. The fee billing for full-time equivalent, that would be the easiest example of one that's changed drastically. And I just needed to catch up with where the world has gotten, really.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think you already made a great point in the show, is that these metrics are really guides for us to kind of produce some insights. I think a lot of people lean into them as a gospel that we want to really make sure we adhere to. And can you correct us? That's not exactly what a metric is for. Like, why would we even compare our financials to a benchmark? What good is that?
Yeah. And maybe the book wouldn't even have a place to exist if it wasn't true that there are so few metrics in this space. In fact, you think about it, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, okay, how tall are you? I'll use myself as an example. I'm 5'11". That's an optimistic, that's more an NFL thing. I'm probably 5'10", but let's say 5'11". What should you weigh, David? You're a male, 5'11". Well, you should weigh, I don't know what it is, but it's probably 168 or something. And I weigh 178. So you're 10 pounds overweight. That's a metric, right? So this business kind of grew up without too many of them. And that was when I started. I don't have the professional background that you have as a CPA, but I was starting here, and I would have clients that say, well, how much time should I be billing? And I'm
Yeah.
looking at them and saying, well, I have no idea. What I'll do is I'll go look at all the other
Mm.
branches of the professional services. So I'll look at engineers, architects, lawyers, doctors, whatever. What do they tell their members?
Yeah.
And then now this is the part that's probably going to shock people. I picked a lower number. I picked the lowest number of any branch of the professional services, and I said, all right, surely we can hit that. And we don't. We don't even hit that.
Oh, wow. This is not sounding very scientific.
No, I know. This is going to be the show you recorded and never released, I bet.
That's right. Yeah. This is the show that wrecked David Baker's career.
Yeah, that's right.
It's all been a sham, people. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so no, there are some particular things, and just like, the accounting profession, the digital agency profession, these professions put labels on things, and then everybody's supposed to try to figure out what that means. So I'm interested to dive into some of these. But the first one I want to dive into is we do a lot of consulting and accounting, financial related advisement and help with agencies. And so revenue recognition is something they all struggle with. They're like, good Lord, there's got to be a piece of software to help us do it. Everybody uses spreadsheets. We have to adapt to the client's spreadsheet. So, what is revenue recognition? What are we trying to display on financials to show what's earned? And why is it so hard? Or what's the strategy of doing this well? Can you talk about that?
I think so. This is fun to dive into. I could start by saying that there's a sort of a lateral, sort of a sister example that will make more sense to your listeners here in this space. So, for instance, we're always saying, how do we know which of our marketing efforts are actually effective? So this digital ad, did it really drive revenue, or this billboard or whatever? And if we can demonstrate what really worked, then we can eliminate the things that didn't work, and we can focus more money on the things that did work. Okay, so when we take that concept and we apply that to your question, we're saying, okay, how much is this client paying for? And did we price the work appropriately? And did we stay within whatever scope boundaries we established at the beginning so that we didn't begin to eat away our profit? That's really the whole essence of revenue attribution. And if you think about all the things that it takes to run a firm, for marketing, creative, digital firms, the least favorite thing they do is the accounting. And so they usually don't pay attention to this, which is why you have a job, right?
Right.
But they don't pay attention to this until things get bad enough that they really have to start doing it. And then they dive in and they realize, oh my God, I thought this client was really profitable and they aren't. And then, of course, the opposite, right? I didn't think we were making much money, but we're making a lot of money on this one. So it's just a basic kind of stuff. That's what revenue attribution is, really.
Yeah, and what we find, any kind of entrepreneur really gets hyper focused on things, and so it's hard for agency entrepreneurs to really balance what they're looking at. If they focus on like revenue recognition or attribution, as you're calling it, they can sometimes become hyper focused, and sometimes we're like, hey, all of this stuff, we're trying our best, and sometimes good enough is really good enough to actually run a business. And so do you find agency entrepreneurs really, they dive into a metric and they try to make their whole company meet it, when really that's not the point? It's just a guide to give them knowledge and insight.
Yes, I think you've just landed. I think what you just stated is really, really critical. In fact, the people that bore down into a metric and make everybody sort of wear a badge are the really annoying leaders that nobody wants to work for. And usually that is focused around timekeeping,
for sure,
which I think turns a lot of employees off. And if I could just add one other thing here to just reinforce what you're saying, I don't think we ought to care that much about individual project profitability. I think we ought to care about the entire client relationship profitability. So it's okay to break even or even lose money every once in a while on a project. What really matters is what is the sum of the projects and whether that entire client relationship is profitable. Now that brings up a question. It's like, well, what things should we be capturing? And in our field, a lot of these folks feel like they can capture sort of the worker bees, the ones who are writing or designing or coding,
Yeah.
and they don't feel like they can charge as much, or they feel like they need to hide sometimes all the other things that are a part of that, and like project management and account management.
Yeah.
And my theory is that clients notice deficiencies in project management and account management long before they notice deficiencies in the quality of the work itself. And so we care more about the quality of the product, and we tend to underemphasize the account and project management. Clients are the opposite. And the idea that we need to throw project management and account management in and not charge as much for that is ludicrous, because that's what clients notice. Those things.
That is really interesting. That's a great example of hyper focusing in on some logo or website for a client, when really it's how have you been treating each other and collaborating throughout. Will they be a long-term client is what will continue to create ongoing profit. But we miss that, right? Sometimes we get so focused on the trees, we miss the whole forest of the relationship. So and that kind of knowledge, I guess, comes from maturity over time. You start to go, hey, I think caring for a client actually brings a lot more profit than producing the exact right logo. I think we all know that.
If you're working with the client and you discover that, they don't have enough of a cash cushion, or they're not making enough money personally, or there's not enough leftover profit, and you point that out to them, they're going to say, oh, yeah, I think you're right. Well, then how do you fix that unless you dive in to some of this revenue attribution stuff to figure out where the problem is? And once you figure it out, you change the habits, and then you back up again and you relieve some of that pressure on all the minutia once you figure out where the problem is.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay. All right. So this next label, utilization, what a wonderful term. What
just warms your heart, doesn't it?
I know, I just love it.
When I grow up, I want to be a utilization expert. Probably not.
I want to turn humans into machines and put them on a spreadsheet, right? That's how you really track a human, on a spreadsheet. So what is utilization? What is the purpose of it? That's a higher level, what the heck is that thing? And the other one is, how do you freaking calculate it? And how do you calculate it if some agencies are truly turning away from time and materials? They're turning into value pricing based entities, and they really are moving away from the tracking of an hour for a human. So talk to me about all of that.
So what I'm trying to do is to get our industry to move away from their default way of measuring success, and that is usually by measuring how busy people are. So they don't feel like they have a problem unless there's people sitting around. And I feel like they ought to be thinking of things very differently. So when I'm looking at utilization, I'm really looking at two things and seeing if there's a gap between them. So the first thing we're looking at is economic opportunity. Okay. So if we have a certain size firm, we have a certain expectation of how much we're going to make, either by hour or by job or by day or whatever it is. And we multiply all that out, and we see what would happen if we had a great mix of clients that not only kept us busy, but paid what they should. That's economic opportunity.
Okay.
And in a typical firm that does track time, you take, there are 5 things that you multiply together and you come up with that economic opportunity. One is, what's the normal hourly rate? How many people do we have? How many hours are they working? How many weeks a year are they working? And then what's the basic benchmark of how much time the firm as a whole should be capturing? And that's 60%. Okay. So we add all that up together, and that's what the economic opportunity is. Then we balance that against the second thing, and that's the actual. What money did they actually make? And so the target is 60%, and the actual for developed cultures, firms like this in developed cultures, is 42%. So the average firm is 18 percentage points low. Not because they're not busy. People are busy generally all the time. What's happening is that there's some degree, and you never know where this is until you dig into a firm, but there's some degree of underpricing the work and or over servicing the clients. There's some degree of that. So that's the whole theory behind utilization, which is really economic opportunity.
Okay, that makes sense. So the metric is, what is the economic opportunity? At least let's come up with a calculation, and you benchmark your revenue against it and see if you're hitting it.
Yeah. Now, nice. I want to touch on something that you raised about, well, how do you do this with a firm that's more mature and just doesn't think about time and materials, but is really about value pricing, right? Well, I wish that was a much bigger problem than it is, but the truth is, I think of pricing sort of on 3 levels: high school, college, and grad school. So the typical agency is in high school here, and they're not getting paid for all their time. And I want to move them to college next, and that means I'm just going to get them paid for all their time. That's the first step.
Okay.
Once they get there, the next step to grad school is to get paid based on a value pricing approach, which means that they're making more money than if they were just getting paid for their time. But most firms are in high school and they want to go straight to grad school and skip college.
Right.
And to get to solve the first problem, you've got to figure out, I don't know any other way than to track it by units. It doesn't have to be by hour. It could be by day, or it could be by person, or whatever it is, but there's some unit. And then once you've got that solved, then you just forget timekeeping and you go to value-based pricing. But my theory is that no firm should always be using time tracking. Time tracking is by default turned off. It's only turned on when there's a specific problem to solve. And once you've solved that problem, you turn it back off.
Nice. Okay. I love that. There's so much to dive into that, and maybe we'll touch on it as we get into some of these other questions, because I definitely don't want to miss any of these. But I love what you said is, a lot of times if we do any work with agencies on pricing, and we walk them through this 3-option price, they can really come down and go, I tried that, the client didn't buy it, so value pricing's crap. It doesn't work. That's not actually how it works. But also, value pricing is completely disruptive to an organization. It changes the fundamental psyche even of how the company has to work. When you move from a time and billing to a value pricing, it's not really the revenue you're making. It changes the belief system of the company. And that's what that's what you have to move through very methodically, right? To college, then to grad school. And is that right? It changes the organization, and that's what they don't address is organizational change, I guess, a lot of times.
Absolutely right. Okay. Absolutely right. You can't do value pricing unless you have a really tight positioning that distinguishes you from most of the other firms. Right. Or I guess unless you're just really arrogant, and then you could be great at value pricing, but most people aren't that confidence inspiring. And so they have to have a tight positioning, and it changes how they sell too. It's, and how they price, and then how they manage the work. It's a really advanced sort of a way to think. And it's not, but the reason so many firms are chasing value pricing, it's not because of economics, it's because their feelings are constantly hurt that clients don't value their work, and they're just tired of that. And that's just not a great approach to value pricing. Value pricing is a very expertise-driven approach. It's not something that should flow from, geez, my feelings are hurt because they keep questioning my prices. That's not what promotes great value pricing.
Okay, that's a good point. All right, so we could dive into value pricing, but I want to hit some of these.
Am I being too honest here? Am I being way too David Bakerish?
This is good stuff. I don't think anybody's worried about you being too honest, so we're okay.
Okay,
we're all fine.
Okay,
we're fine, David. We're used to you by now.
Okay.
So this next one is resources, capacity management. It's kind of it's pretty related to what we've been talking about. What the heck is resource management, capacity management? What is that? How is it related to tracking utilization? Kind of put all that in a box or put it together for us.
Yeah,
that's a lot.
It's sort of a complicated story in the sense that I didn't really develop a theory around this until I recognized that in the most well-run firms that are doing great work and making money, and they're fun places to work. In those kinds of firms, there's always a really delicate balance they've achieved between the account management function and the project management function. And if those two are not separated, and if they're not staffed by the right people, then things break down. So account management is charged. Well, there's a lot of things they do, but at the very core of what account management does is they are there to shepherd the account and grow it. And the project management side is there to protect two things. One is to protect the work-life balance of the team. So we're not just making people work really hard to fulfill those promises, and to protect the profitability of the firm. If you don't keep those separate, account managers are driven by this desire to get clients to say yes. And in that process, they are willing to lower the pricing barrier to get the client to say yes. And that is not in the firm's best interest. So resource management is a very careful balance between account management and project management. And what was really interesting in my research around this was that there is a very distinct personality type for each one of those. And if you don't get that right, then you have, so for instance, if you have project managers who are functioning as account managers, then they miss personal cues that things are going off track. And they also don't ever grow the account, because a project manager says, all right, my job is to fulfill every promise that's been made. The last thing I want is more promises, which are just going to be more opportunities to screw up. Right. So anyway, that's the whole theory. And then it kind of builds to this big system around it.
Well, if you have, is account management, is that a role that you typically see in larger agencies? So what if you have an agency, 10 people and under, do you find that role embedded in the PM role? And that's what you're saying, you got to grow out of that? Is like, we don't see account managers in smaller firms typically, or should we?
Well, you usually don't. There's usually not enough account management to keep one person busy until you have about 7, 8, 9 people total at the firm.
Okay.
And then you keep adding them. Account management, it depends on what kind of firm you are, but it represents anywhere from 12 to 18% of the total activity.
Okay. Yeah.
And then project management is sometimes a little bit less than that with a traditional marketing firm, a little bit more than that with a digital-oriented firm.
Okay, nice. Okay, so that's kind of the front end of resource capacity management that the team's trying to manage, these PMs and account managers. Now, is there any level of teaching we should be given to each person on the team to manage scope, to know, hey, you got to know when you're starting to step over the line of what we've promised and not overserve? Like, what individual training do you give to team to start to recognize their own scope seepage? Do you do that? Is that worth it?
It is something important to do. I think that needs to be housed in the PM function, project management function, because they tend to be the most objective. They don't care whether the client likes the price or not. They're informed entirely on what it takes to get something done. So that's where it happens. But the project management people are not dictators that control everything. They are housing the most valuable information that is freely given out to everybody so that they can do their jobs. So they listen to a lot of people, they gather data, they filter it, they say, oh, okay, this developer told me that he needs 380 hours for this. And I've worked with him a lot, and he always underestimates it. So I'm going to apply the Jared filter to this, right? And they have all these different tools that help them do that. And it's an art. It really takes a very unique skill. And I think PMs are probably the most underappreciated people in our industry.
Yeah. It's
other than consultants like me, that would be right up there too.
That's right. Well, one thing that's interesting in the accounting profession, we actually it runs very similarly, right? It's a knowledge deliverable type industry, and there are no project managers in the accounting industry. Now, in our firm, we put a project manager now on a leadership team kind of to lead our team, years ago. And so why did the digital agency or even the traditional advertising agency profession adopt this role? Was it to separate, project management out of the role of the doer? The technical doer was also probably at some point managing their work too. And like the accounting profession hasn't even figured it out yet. So why did this profession figure that out, that there has to be a role to manage the knowledge scope being piped through this company?
I love that question. And the answer is very obvious to me, but it's a little bit comical in that the last 3 big developments in our field have all been reactionary, and they've been reactionary against the direction that the AMs have taken us. And the AMs have been very forceful, and they are very persuasive by nature. So if you're a great AM, you have the ability to persuade other people. And so they tend to get their way. The movement, the industry wakes up, sees the movement that's happening, and then corrects it. So the first one was the movement against account managers being in charge of new business. And they were really good at it, but then they stayed involved in the account. They couldn't let it go. Their job was to go kill something and drag it back to the cave and then leave it and go back, kill something else.
Right.
They couldn't do that. And so once they got involved in fixing the food, then nobody was doing new business. So we said, okay, we got to have different new business people. The second movement was when they started to make shit up all the time in a strategy setting. And we said, listen, you're really good at convincing clients what they should do, but it's not based on science. We need to have, and this movement grew out of the UK in the 60s and 70s, and that's where account planning grew up, just to counter what AMs were doing. The third movement touches on what you're talking about, and that's where AMs were consistently over-promising to the client, and so a strong PM component grew. It didn't just grow out of nothing. It grew out of a basically a traffic movement that said, oh, okay, you traffic people, you're pretty good at this. I wonder if you could also do these other things. And so now in the most advanced, really thoughtful firms that get this balance right, the PMs are in charge of 6 things. The first thing they're in charge of is, and this is starting from most important to least important. First thing they're charged with is objective pricing, whatever it really costs to get the work done. Second, capacity management, which touches on your resourcing question. Like, how are we going to have enough people to do this, to meet the deadlines? Do we need more work? Do we need more people? All of that. Third was quality control or quality assurance. Fourth was managing the relationship with external contractors. Fifth was making sure that we're watching scope, the time spent, and then 6 was, are we meeting the deadlines? That's in essence, those are the 6 roles that a good resourcing plan has.
That's awesome. That's some gold, man. Now if we can just figure out how to get people to do it, right?
Yeah. Now if we could find more than just you and I that care about this, we'll be fine.
That's right. Okay, so let me ask you something, and I wonder if this is one of the metrics you changed. So let me just read it out. If you take an agency's last 12 months of AGI, right, and divide it by their FTEs, and it ranges between, I think your book, and this comes out of your book, $95,000 to $110,000, right? So we want to see each FTE over a 12-month period producing about 95 to 110. You say regardless of billable or non-billable team,
right?
What if, is that a metric you're updating? What if an agency is not meeting that range? And again, it's for billable and non-billable, so it's the whole freaking shooting match of the whole company should be producing about 95 to 110, even though some work on revenue generation and some don't necessarily. Is that metric updated? And what's the problem if they're not meeting that range?
Yeah, so that was the most serious change that needed to be
Okay.
made, in that about 80% of firms are smack dab in the 155 to 160 fee billings per full-time equivalent employee. That's so if you're right in that range, then you are very typical, you're very average. Your mom has your pictures on the refrigerator, but nobody else thinks they're amazing. You're just a normal kid. And if you're below that, you're struggling in some pretty serious ways. About 20% of firms are above that. So that one needed to be updated. I want to make one note about why we're looking at everybody and not just the billable people.
Yeah.
The reason is because if you were just looking at the billable people, then that standard would have to be a lot higher, but that wouldn't correct for firms that have a real core efficient billable center that's supported by this bloated administrative staff.
Right.
And that's why you look at the whole thing. So
yeah. Okay.
So that now, and then your second part of your question was, what do you do if that's low?
Yeah.
And the way I look at it is, I think of it as sort of a 3-step process. It isn't always exactly this neat, but the first thing I would do is say, all right, let's do our cost accounting, revenue attribution. Let's get timekeeping out. Let's do it the right way. There's lots of different steps in that. That's the first thing. Second thing we're going to do is let's make sure that we have this balance right between the AM and the PM side based on what we just talked about. And then the third thing is, all right, we probably need to look at our positioning too. We probably need to figure out how we can charge for more than just covering our time. How can we provide more value to our clients and based on positioning? How can we be different from these other firms? So that would be the three. I mean, it's a year-long process, but those are the 3 steps.
Okay. No, yeah. So that stuff takes a long time, and probably most professions are not differentiated from a positioning point of view very well anyway, right? That most people are just, because that takes a little bit of bravery, guts to position in a different way.
Exactly.
Okay. Because that's what leads to expertise and pricing, right? That's a byproduct of positioning well.
Yeah. So if we apply this to you, I don't know, there's millions of accounting firms out there. Are they any different? Well, some of them make fewer mistakes than others, whatever. Your firm is different primarily because of the audience you focus on. And so you understand their world better than an accounting firm that only has one of your clients, because you've got dozens and dozens of firms and you've learned the common characteristics between them. That's what I mean by positioning. And most firms are not well positioned, although the percentage of well-positioned firms is higher than it ever has been, but it's still not great.
Okay. And why is it higher? Is that there's just been more training and teaching on that in the past 20, 30 years?
Partly. I mean, I'm not the only one that's been beating that drum. 20 or 30 people have been, but it's mainly because of Google. So if you think about 25 years ago, you had a geographic moat around your work. So you were addressing clients that were close enough to you, and anybody that was within your geographic sphere was a potential client. When the internet came along, all of a sudden that moat disappeared, and not only could you go work for anybody in the country or the world, but anybody could come and take your clients too.
Yeah.
That was part of it. The other was that set up this expectation that, marketing or digital or whatever it is, creative, it's different for different firms. And so if I'm going to do CPG packaging, that's different than if I'm going to do experiential marketing. So now I need to be focused so that when somebody looks for something, they type it in a search bar, I come up as an option for them.
Yeah. So in a sense, the world's changed. So we get to focus on the way the world is changing now, because companies do more CPG, right? They're direct to consumer. They're doing more specific kind of things. So now we have to change and serve those more specific focus type clients.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. We live on a 61-acre farm. We got the property really cheap because the third of a mile driveway was really lame. You had to have a 4-wheel drive vehicle to get up it. And we looked at it and said, I'll bet we could fix that.
Okay.
So I'm thinking now, in the past, 30 years ago, I would have just talked to neighbors and I would have said, hey, what should I do here? And I would have gotten a mix of shitty ideas and good ideas. But now I can just go to YouTube and I know some fool has put up a 60-minute YouTube video that answers exactly the question, and I can get that within minutes, and it's free. It's like that's how we think about information anymore. It's just a different world.
That is crazy. Yeah. I mean, if I need a new dishwasher, which I just bought one, it's YouTube is where I go, and everybody's shooting videos for me, and I'm like, why are they doing that? Just crazy.
Yeah, that's what I mean by fools. You didn't pay anything, but you got a much better answer within just minutes.
I know. It's wild. All right. So labor. So labor's a pretty big cost to agencies. So is it 50 to 55% total team and owners? And not contractors, but 50 to 55%. Has that changed? Is that going to change? Is it changing now in our market because freaking labor is very expensive right now? So tell me about that labor metric.
Yeah. So here, a lot of us in this field measure this very differently, and I'll just admit that the way I measure it has to do with the fact that my client base is international. So I've got clients in 42 countries, and so I can't come up with a metric that only works in the U.S. Yeah. Even Canada is very different than the U.S. Australia is even more different. What I worked on is I wanted to develop a metric that could be used anywhere in the world. And so that's why mine is different. And mine says that I'm going to measure just unburdened labor. So unburdened means before taxes, before benefits, and before bonuses. And my measurement is 45%. You shouldn't spend more than 45% of your total fee base on unburdened comp. And that's why your metric of 50 or 55 is higher than mine, because I'm just saying it's all unburdened.
Okay, that makes sense, because when we give that metric to our clients, it's dumping the taxes, the retirement plans in there. Right. And I see what you're saying. Right. Okay. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs also, speaking of labor, they want to know, how do they pay themselves, principal compensation. And I think we've seen 10 to 12% of a gross margin sometimes is what maybe a principal could make. Is that changing, or would you, I guess, anyway, it's the entrepreneur, it's the owner. Sometimes they don't get a paycheck if they're struggling, right? So how the heck do you actually calculate that?
Yeah. So I back up philosophically and I say, all right, there's 3 reasons why you get paid as an owner. One is for the risks that you're taking. Another is for what you own. And the third is for what you do. Okay. So for what you own, if you own 100% of a firm, but you don't work at it, you probably don't get a salary, but you get all the distributions, right?
Yeah, right.
I haven't heard the metric that you offered, so that may very well be a great way to look at it. The way I look at it is I just say, listen, there's more risk associated with a bigger firm. You need to benchmark your compensation based on how big your firm is. So I say, if you've got 1 to 4 people, you should be making at least 100,000 plus distributions. If you've got 5 to 8, it should be 170, and it keeps going up until you hit about 400, and then I think that's where it caps out. But then you would make, and I feel really strongly that principals need to be on a very specific fixed compensation method, and they should. It's sort of like the profit first model. Can't remember the guy's last name, but that's the whole idea.
Yep.
And exactly. So he's keynoting the conference I'm doing in a couple months. Cool. It's about you need to make this much money as an owner all the time, and the last thing that needs to get cut is what you're paying yourself. So that's my theory. And so then what's that amount? There's lots of ways to do it. I just benchmark it based on brackets of people. Yeah.
And that makes sense. And a lot of times, as when we do consulting with agencies trying to grow, a lot of times we find really just dysfunction and misbehavior in the entrepreneurial's life. And so they'll overspend even in their personal life and built really their agency. And sometimes we have to say, well, you can't live that way and actually go through a pandemic. So you got to correct actually some beliefs you have about what you think you have a right to. And so a lot of this consulting gets into a lot of psychology and counseling or therapy or yelling and crying, whatever the session calls for at that time.
Isn't that interesting how like there are certain topics we're not allowed to talk about much. We can be with friends and we can talk about sex lives, but we can't talk about how people raise their kids or how they spend their money.
That's right.
It's like those are the two things that are taboo, and here you are trying to tackle one of those, but I don't like, unless you are on the same page philosophically, I don't know how you can really help your clients. So I totally get what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, it's hard. You can't say, hey, you can't afford that car. Like, what benchmark are you using to actually make that claim? But we do have metrics.
And then they're thinking, well, heck, I kind of hate my job. How can you really work with your clients unless you're allowed to talk about those things? You may think they can't afford this car. What they're thinking is, I kind of hate my job. This is my reward for the job I don't like.
Right.
And you're saying, well, let's fix the job. Let's not overspend. Let's fix the job.
That's right. Well, and we also ask them the question. My partner, she asked me 10 years ago, she said, okay, you want to grow the companies. Do you want what that means? And I'm like, that I knew what she meant. So it was upsetting when she asked me. So you can claim what you want, but do you want what that means? Which for an entrepreneur, it's an up and down journey a lot of times. And so you don't necessarily get to meet the metric of what a metric says you should get paid sometimes. It just depends, and it's tough. So so kind of leaning into that, and we only have just a couple more minutes, but what about cash on hand? Is 2 to 4 months of, let's say, average operating expenditures good to keep on hand so you can, buffer yourself through storms and make investments? So what would you tell people on keeping cash in the bank?
Right. So there's a certain logic to half of this. So like nobody argues that you shouldn't have much cash sitting around.
Right.
But some people think, well, what's the problem with having too much around, right? And there's two problems with that. Your model of 2 to 4 months is perfect for me. I think any thinner of a cash cushion, then you tend to make decisions based on panic and not the longer term view of things. But if you have too much money in the business, there's two problems with it. One is that a corporation exists primarily to protect what's not in it, not what's in it. And so if there's a lawsuit or, like the average wrongful dismissal lawsuit is settled for $110,000. So, the more money there is in the corporation, the more that's subject to some sort of a lien or whatever. But the bigger issue is more psychological. If you've got lots of money in there, then you don't feel the pressure to make smart decisions, and you can get a little bit lazy. So I feel like you ought to keep it somewhere between 2 and 4. I prefer the 3 to 4 range.
Okay.
And you take the extra money out, and if you're nervous about spending it, then don't buy a boat with it, but leave it in a separate personal account that you could then loan back to the business if it's needed. That sends you a signal that, the business isn't doing as well as it should. I have to put some money back in. What do I need to do differently so I don't need to do this again? So it's just a good management practice.
Okay, good stuff. All right, one last question. So, David, you got to give me
This is a really good question. This is the very best question.
Yeah, this is the very best question. It's very personal, and hopefully you'll piss people off and make some people happy. So tell me about your belief on debt, term debt, line of credit.
Carrying your Amex. Going here, aren't you? You're going here.
Tell us give us your opinion, David. Get yourself in trouble. This is good stuff. What would you do if you ran an agency?
I would have no debt whatsoever for any reason. If I was going to make a compromise on debt, it would just be for an appreciating asset. And there are some, like a house or an office building, which of course wouldn't be owned by the company itself, would be owned by you personally in a separate corporation. But I just think we misuse debt a lot. And I am admittedly off the deep end on this one. I just think debt is nearly evil, and I wouldn't use it for anything that wouldn't be. And debt is a product that we're being sold by people. They don't want to enslave us. They just want us to they want us to help their business. And I don't, in a business that's run well, I don't think debt is necessary. I mean, there are exceptions to that. I think there are times when I think you ought to have a credit line, but you should never use it. So that's where, I'm just a little odd on that.
Well, no, that's good. And I know a lot of people could argue in one way or the other. So that's good stuff. Well, we're trying to get all this out into the world so people can make good decisions. So, David, thanks so much for joining us. Do you think, should people really just be on your newsletter list, and that's where they're going to find out about you, the book coming out? That's really the best way we can hear from the things you got going on. Is that right?
That is, yeah. Okay. So davidcbaker.com, and there's a letter that goes out by email every Sunday. Usually it's free. I'd love to have as many subscribers as want to be there.
Okay.
Assuming that I still have a business after this. We'll see.
There you go. Okay. Well, that's right. Maybe we ruined the career of David C. Baker.
Yeah.
I hope not. All right. David, thanks for joining us on the Businessology Show. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Jason.
Take care.